Contemplation, the end of man. We've already looked at contemplation. Now we're going to look at it precisely in Aristotle's amazing assertion that in contemplation, most of all, is the flourishing, the end of the human person. So we defined contemplation as an intellectual gazing inspired by love, especially a gazing at the highest things, the highest realities. We'll do another video on the end of a natural thing, but just to state here, the end of a thing is its flourishing, the highest actualization of its natural potential. So to claim that something is the end of man is to say this is most of all the flourishing of human nature, when the human person will be most actualized, the natural potential of human nature is most actualized. So what arguments does Aristotle give for this? He gives a number. I'm going to focus quickly on just several of them. First of all, he claims that contemplation is the most pleasant of human activities. Now you might say, well, who's he to say that? Isn't what someone finds pleasant? Isn't that very relative? You know, Aristotle's great teacher Plato was very concerned about this. He talks about this in the Republic. I'll just note here in passing. He says, there might be an objectivity here that is not immediately evident in our experience because we don't immediately recognize that some are better in a position to know the truth. And so what some people judge to be so that's different from others, maybe it's because they actually see reality better. And so this is one of those moments where I think that's what Aristotle is going to claim. Those, the wise, who say that contemplation is the most pleasant of activities, well, for various reasons, they're the ones in a position to know. And maybe most of the rest of us are too inexperienced in contemplation to have seen that. Another thing he says about contemplation is it can be most continuous among human activities. Fascinating point. And here we just might see what he means by that is as opposed to a courageous activity, which is a very important one in life, you don't always have an opportunity to be courageous. But contemplation is something that is kind of continuously and more readily available. And so we can contemplate in a very ongoing way, not without stopping, he notes, but in a rather continuous way. He also says that contemplation is the activity that's most loved for its own sake. When you ask why you're contemplating, it's not because of something outside the contemplation. It always has its reason within itself, its lovability in the very doing. It's very closely connected to the last thing I'll point out from Aristotle. He says contemplation is the most leisurely of activities. We've talked about leisure in other videos. Leisure, that kind of activity that most has its worth in itself. So this is really that same point of desirable for its own sake. Contemplation is the activity most leisurely. Is Aristotle, in holding the contemplation as the end of man, is he an outlier? Plato, in his great dialogue called the Symposium, which was on love, the culmination of it, he says, now we've come to the goal in all loving. And what is that goal? To gaze upon the beautiful itself, the divine beauty. What would be a greater life than to gaze upon the divine beauty? There's Plato. And we can note in the Christian tradition, probably the most specific, precise name of paradise or heaven is the beatific vision, the seeing that beatifies, the seeing that makes happy. Application, implications. Let's just go back to Aristotle for a minute. After he talks about contemplation as the end of man and talks about what a life would look like with as much contemplation as possible, he says it's almost like he breaks out and says, but perhaps such a life is too high for man. Perhaps that's divine. It's for the gods. Can we even call it human? And it's like he catches himself and says, well, but it is human, because it would seem there's something divine in the human. So what should we take away from that? Well, maybe we take away Central to our calling, no matter what our vocation life, central to our calling is to try to become more capable of contemplation and to make contemplation in some way enliven all of our life, that it might, as it were, be the yeast that leavens our whole life. What does that look like? Could do another video called Contemplation Rich Activity. In case this is something so worthy of our ongoing reflection.